word that went around South Central was simple and final. Eric Holder killed Nipsey Hussle, and for that, they came back for everything he loved. They went for his baby mama, mother, grandmother in one single afternoon, wiped off the map while he sat in a cell with no way to stop it. Overnight, he became the most hated name in Los Angeles. But somewhere between what the streets swore happened and what anybody could prove, a harder question sits waiting. Who really paid for Nipsey? And did the thing everybody repeated ever happen at all? Eric Holder Jr. was 29 years old and came up out of the rolling 60s, the same Crenshaw area neighborhood Crips that raised Nipsey Hussle. Holder rapped under the name Shitty Cuz, and it went nowhere for him. Nipsey, 4 years older, had taken the exact same block and turned it into a career, a clothing store, and a business empire that reached far past the corner. On March 31st, 2019, a little after 3 in the afternoon, both men landed in the parking lot of the Marathon clothing store at Slauson and Crenshaw, a strip mall Nipsey had bought and filled with his own businesses. Nipsey pulled up unannounced, no security, no fanfare, and sat in his car a few minutes before he got out to greet the people already there. He stood in shorts and a wave cap, comfortable, on ground he owned. Holder arrived a different way, riding in the passenger seat of a white Chevy Cruze, driven by a woman named Brianna Nicholson, a Lyft driver and caregiver who had picked him up as a fare about a month earlier and started spending time with him. She turned into the busy lot, spotted Nipsey, and lit up, having no idea the man next to her knew him. Holder said nothing. He got out shirtless, crossed to the burger spot, ordered food, and walked over to the group while it cooked. The two men shook hands and talked. The conversation turned to a rumor moving around the neighborhood that Holder had been cooperating with police, and Nipsey told him plainly to go get his paperwork and clear the word off his name. Every account of that exchange describes it the same way. Calm, ordinary, the kind of advice one man from the set gives another who's been gone a while and needs to fix something before it hardens. Both men had been pulled into the rolling 60s young. Both carried the same code about respect and reputation that the neighborhood runs on, and inside that code the word Nipsey used carried more freight than an outsider could hear. That shared language is the reason a quiet conversation in a parking lot turned into a killing in under 20 minutes. Holder waved it off. He posed for a photo with Nicholson, finished up in the lot, got his food, and climbed back into her car. Then the day bent. He had her drive around the block, and as they looped back, he sat loading a magazine, so openly that she asked whether he planned to shoot from her car. He put the gun away and directed her behind the restaurant, into an alley, where he ate his fries and pulled a red shirt over his head. He told her to wait. He walked back through the alley toward the mall. He came up the sidewalk, stepped between two parked cars where Nipsey stood with 3 other men, and told him he was through. He fired with a semi-automatic in one hand and a revolver in the other, backing out and coming back in twice, and put around 10 rounds into Nipsey's body. Through the lungs, through the spine, a graze across the head. Nipsey dropped like dead weight and never moved his legs again. Holder walked over and kicked him in the head as he lay bleeding. 2 other men in that tight space caught rounds. Kerry Lathan, 56, freshly home after 25 years in prison, and a man Nipsey had never met but had sent a care package of clothes, took a bullet in the back that put him in a wheelchair. Sherman Villanueva caught a round that fragmented on his belt buckle and left him with surface wounds. The cameras caught most of it. A gas station lens fixed on the lot had recorded Nipsey pulling in at 2:50, sitting in his car a few minutes, then stepping out to greet the men already there, and the same web of lenses tracked Holder's entire loop, into the burger spot, over to the group, back to the car, into the alley, and back up the sidewalk with a gun in each hand. Investigators pulled 8 shell casings from a .40 caliber semi-automatic off the ground, and the rest of the rounds came from a revolver that keeps its casings inside the cylinder, which put the total somewhere around 13 shots fired into that narrow space in a matter of seconds. Holder ran back the way he came, past the cameras, both guns visible, jumped in Nicholson's car, and told her to drive before he slapped her. She dropped him in Long Beach, let him stay the night at her mother's place, and the next day used her ID to get him a motel room because he had none. When her car turned up on the news as the wanted vehicle, her mother drove her to the police, where she handed over her phone, her car, her home, and her mother's home to be searched, sat for hours of interviews, and testified under immunity. She was never charged. Holder surrendered 2 days after the shooting at a mental health clinic in Bellflower, and the deputies took him without a fight. When they picked him up, he was still wearing the same clothes. The woman who'd driven him had no record and no ties to any gang. Born in the South, raised partly in Los Angeles, working as a caregiver and driving rideshare on the side, a month into knowing a man she barely understood. She'd seen him with guns before and assumed, the way a lot of young men his age from that area carried, that he kept them for protection. She had no idea until the news told her that the shooting she'd sat feet away from and the killing of Nipsey Hussle were the same event. Nipsey died in the parking lot he owned, 33 years old, one day before he was scheduled to sit down with the LAPD chief and the police commissioner to talk about slowing gang violence in his own community. The city broke open, and from the second Holder's face hit the screen as the man who did it, the story stopped belonging to any courtroom. The court still did their part. In July 2022, a jury convicted Holder of first-degree murder, and the sentence came back at 60 years to life. They found him guilty on lesser counts for the two wounded men and acquitted him of trying to murder them. His prior record trailed behind him into the trial, a 2009 domestic case that got dismissed, a loaded gun charge in 2012 that earned him jail time and probation, a probation violation after that, the resume of a man who had already been drifting. His lawyer argued heat of passion, a snitch accusation that enraged him past thinking. The jury didn't buy it, but long before that number came down, the neighborhood had already begun collecting on a different kind of debt. While the trial was still running, Holder got jumped inside jail, cut across the back of the head with a razor, left with a swollen face and 3 staples holding his scalp shut, and the attack was serious enough that the judge sent the jury home for the day. On a separate transfer, an account went around of Holder recognized on a jail bus, everyone on board turning at once, and then the men riding with him spitting on him and worse. That much people could point to. The rest came as whispers, and the whispers moved faster than anything that could be checked. Within days, the word running through Los Angeles was that the retaliation had not stopped at Holder's body, that it had reached his blood. The claim, repeated on corners and then on camera, was that a wave of shootings tore through his family the same day he killed Nipsey, that his baby mama, his mother, and his grandmother had all been put down, that anyone tied to him by blood had a target on them. A known voice in hip-hop media repeated that relatives had been hit. Another posted a photo he swore came from the crime scene of one of Holder's own and called him a longtime informant on top of it. The LAPD reportedly thickened patrols to hold the peace. The claim mutated as it moved. Some versions counted 2 relatives, some counted 4, some folded in a half-brother found dead in a house and ruled a suicide. Each teller added a body, and none of them added a source. And the legend, already sprinting, left the truth somewhere back at the starting line. The story that killing Nipsey had cost Holder not only his freedom, but everyone who shared his name. Whether a single piece of it happened is the thing nobody stopped to ask while they were passing it along. To understand the machinery that turned on Eric Holder, you have to sit with a single word, because in the world both men came from, that word carries more weight than a verdict: snitch. In gang life, the accusation lands like a sentence with no appeal, a mark that follows a man onto every yard, every block, every visiting room for the rest of his days, and the people who live that life will tell you it is the most dangerous thing you can be called and have believed. Nipsey handled it the gentle way, the way the older heads say you're supposed to. He pulled Holder aside, told him the word was out there, and pointed him toward the paperwork that could kill the rumor. It was closer to a favor than a threat. The men standing there that afternoon felt no hostility in it, and Nipsey himself brushed the whole thing off, the way a man does when he assumes the person in front of him will fix the problem like any grown man would. There's a version of this the defense leaned on at trial, walking a jury from the schoolyard up into the gang world, how everyone learns young that nobody likes a tattletale, and how that childhood rule curdles, in a place governed by the code, into something that gets a man buried. Being called a snitch by a sibling is an insult you shrug off. Being called one as a gang member, out loud in front of witnesses, is a green light. An accusation that on the yard and on the block alike hands everyone around you permission to move on you. The word doesn't wound, it marks. What nobody in that lot could see was the state of the man receiving the advice. Holder had drifted out of the neighborhood long before that Sunday, living down in Long Beach with an uncle in conditions bad enough that he begged a woman he'd known for a month to let him crash somewhere cleaner. He carried damage most people around him never registered. A beating years earlier at the hands of another rolling 60 had been brutal enough to require surgery on his brain, and those close to the story describe a man already unstable, already prone to snapping, moving through the world with a fuse that ran shorter than anyone knew. Earlier that very day, he had reportedly pulled a gun on someone else, agitated and altered, worked up over a woman who wanted a photo with Nipsey, already looking for a confrontation before the word snitch ever hit the air. A man that unstable needs almost no reason to pull a trigger, And that's the quiet fact the grander theories keep stepping over. The simplest explanation for the killing had been standing in the parking lot the entire time, shirtless and carrying 2 guns. So the advice that should have slid off him instead sank into a mind that had no give left in it. And the humiliation of being called that word out loud in front of the neighborhood's most beloved son and a woman he'd shown up with, curdled in the 15 minutes it took him to circle the block and load his gun. The prosecution read that moment differently, and their reading cut straight to why a rumor of a family massacre later found such fertile ground. Holder didn't even live in the neighborhood anymore. He'd been gone long enough that a rumor circulating on those blocks shouldn't have been able to reach him, which made the rage look less like wounded reputation and more like something older and more personal. When he finally walked up on the group, the words out of his mouth weren't a denial. He didn't ask why they were talking about him. He told Nipsey he was through, a line that reaches past any single accusation toward a broader rejection. The resentment of a failed rapper standing in front of a man from the same corner who become everything he never would. The kick to the head after 10 rounds was the punctuation. That kind of finish doesn't come from a rumor. It comes from envy that's been sitting a long time. The neighborhood's answer came fast, and the first installment landed on his body. Inside county jail, with cameras and deputies supposedly watching, 2 inmates got to him after a court appearance and opened the back of his head with a razor, and he came out of it with a swollen face, a damaged eye, and staples in his scalp. He was meant to be kept away from general population during transport, a precaution that the system quietly failed to keep, and the failure read to everyone watching as its own kind of message, that no wall in Los Angeles was going to hold the anger back from him for long. The court itself had to bend around the violence, sending jurors home while he got patched up, the machinery of the law forced to pause because the machinery of the street had reached inside it. The jail bus made the point uglier, riding to court on a transfer, packed in with other men from the same city that was still mourning. Holder got clocked by someone who recognized him, and the recognition rippled down the bus until every head had turned toward the man who killed Nipsey Hussle. What followed was the neighborhood's contempt rendered as physical fact, men spitting on him, degrading him, treating him like something that had to be marked and remembered, all of it happening in a moving cage he couldn't escape. That degradation was never really about the ride. It was the code announcing itself, telling anyone who might ever think about helping him, standing near him, claiming him, exactly what proximity would cost. The people who broke it down on the radio the next morning put the same truth in plainer terms. There's nothing more fragile than a wounded ego, and Nipsey telling him to move along, telling his people to handle it, bruised a man's pride enough that he came back to erase the source of it. It was the oldest and stupidest engine there is, rejection answered with a gun. And it fed straight into the exhausting pattern the whole city already knew by heart. You come from the hood, you make it out, and the moment you return to build something, or just to stand on your old block, that's exactly where the bullet finds you. Keep it real or keep it alive. Nipsey had bet his life you could do both, and that spring the bet came due. Because the threat didn't stay pointed at Holder, it fanned outward into a warning that became its own kind of law. That anyone who dared visit him, associate with him, carry his name into a room might catch the same fate. An invisible perimeter hardened around Nipsey's memory, a shield made of pure vengeance, and Holder sat at the center of it like a man radiating danger to everyone he'd ever touched. The people who covered these neighborhoods have a phrase for the loop that produces this: hurt people, and it describes a place where pain gets redistributed to whoever's closest, where trauma passes itself off as culture and gets handed down like an inheritance. Eric Holder was the newest name in a long line of men who took the ache they were carrying and dumped it onto someone who looked exactly like them, and the neighborhood, in answering him, was cutting off its own nose to spite its own face, tearing at itself in grief the way it had torn at itself for generations. None of it brought Nipsey back. Every additional act of retaliation only multiplied the loss, added a wound to a community already bleeding, and did nothing to the one thing everyone actually wanted, which was to rewind to 250 that afternoon and put the man back in his car alive. But grief that has nowhere to go turns into something else. And in South Central that spring, it turned into a hunger for a body count that felt equal to the size of what was taken. Holder's beatings weren't going to be enough to satisfy a city this size, and that hunger, that need for the debt to be paid in full and then some, is exactly the soil in which the next story grew. Because the body the neighborhood kept whispering about wasn't Holder's at all. It was theirs, the ones who shared his blood. The claim, when you strip it down to how people actually told it, was total. Not one relative caught in the crossfire of some unrelated beef, but the whole line erased in a single stroke on the same day Nipsey died. The baby mama, the mother, the grandmother, all of them put in the ground at once. The family handled the way the street handles a debt it considers non-negotiable. It was the kind of story that needs no evidence to travel because it satisfies something deeper than evidence. It closes the loop. It makes the universe fair. A great man dies for nothing in his own parking lot, and in exchange the man who did it watches everyone he loves get taken while he sits helpless behind glass. A symmetry so clean it feels less like news and more like scripture. And it spread the way scripture spreads, mouth to mouth first, then out onto the platforms where things never die. Within days of the murder, the corners were already carrying it, and from the corners it climbed into the media ecosystem that feeds on exactly this material. A prominent voice in hip-hop commentary weighed in that members of Holder's family had been attacked as payback. Another outspoken figure went further, branding Holder a longtime informant, hinting he'd been tied to other killings, and posting an image he claimed showed the crime scene of one of Holder's relatives. A photograph offered as proof to an audience already primed to believe. As the frenzy built, word spread that the LAPD had put more units on the street, and the presence of those patrols became its own evidence in the retelling, a sign that something big enough to require containment must be underway. The names attached to the spread gave it weight it hadn't earned. A well-known figure in hip-hop media stated flatly that relatives had been attacked, and once a voice with reach says a thing out loud, it stops sounding like a corner rumor and starts sounding like reporting. Another commentator, an outspoken presence with his own following, pushed it harder, casting Holder as a career informant, tying his name to other killings, and circulating an image he presented as the crime scene of one of Holder's own people. None of it arrived with a case number, a coroner's finding, or a police confirmation, and none of it needed to. The audience was already leaning in, already wanting the ledger balanced, and each new claim landed on ears that had decided in advance to believe. Later, the count got specific. A commentary channel tallied 4 family members dead in the aftermath. A half-brother found inside a house and ruled a suicide, cousin shot down, and Holder's own father, laying them out one by one as the price the bloodline paid. But even in the telling, the story undercut itself because the same voice that stacked up 4 bodies admitted in the next breath that none of them connected to Nipsey's murder, that these were people who died in their own separate circumstances and happened to share a last name with the most hated man in Los Angeles. The count wanted to be street justice and coincidence at the same time, and it never resolved which one it was. That unresolved contradiction should have been the tell. A revenge campaign and a string of unrelated tragedies are 2 entirely different stories, and a claim that can't decide which one it's telling is usually neither. The machine repeating it, though, wasn't built for scrutiny. It was built for momentum, and momentum was the one thing the story had in abundance, because the system that was supposed to deliver the real reckoning looked slow and far away by comparison. Holder hadn't been to court yet. He'd made no statement, given no interview, and to a public starving for consequence, the legal process felt like it was crawling, while the streets, in the telling, had already finished. There was a debate buried inside the frenzy too, about how far people were willing to go to avenge Nipsey, and that argument did more to spread the story than any single claim, because debating whether the retaliation was justified quietly assumed the retaliation had happened. The question slid from did it happen to should it have, and in that slippage the rumor collected the one thing it could never earn on its own, the presumption of truth. That contradiction is the whole story, because when you go looking for the thing underneath the noise, there's nothing there to hold. No coroner ever tied one of those deaths to retaliation for Nipsey Hussle. No open case, no police statement, no piece of reporting ever confirmed that a wave of revenge killings tore through Holder's family on the day of the murder or any day after. The claim moved at the speed of grief and never once slowed down to pick up proof, and the 4-body version rested entirely on a single channel that dismantled its own premise as it built it. Weighed honestly, the story sits in the category of pure street rumor. A legend the neighborhood built because it needed one, dressed in enough specific detail to sound like fact and never anchored to a single record that survives a second look. Strip the drama and the timeline tells on itself. A killing that reduces a man's mother, his child's mother, and his grandmother to bodies in one afternoon is not the kind of event that stays quiet. It draws press, it draws a coroner, it draws its own headlines, and in a city already saturated with cameras and reporters chasing every angle of the Nipsey story, the total silence around these supposed murders becomes the loudest fact in the whole affair. Absence never proves innocence on its own, but a triple family massacre that leaves no paper, no case, and no coverage in the most covered killing of the year is a massacre that almost certainly never happened, which raises the real question the rumor was designed to avoid: why it stuck at all when the bones of it were this thin. It stuck because it was satisfying in a way the truth refused to be. The truth was a damaged man in a cell with 60 years in front of him, ordinary and grim and going nowhere. The legend was cosmic, the shield of vengeance made literal, the debt collected down to the last cousin, and a wounded city reached for the version that felt like the wound had been answered. The rumor did emotional work that the facts couldn't, and so the facts lost. The way they usually do when a community is looking for something to make the pain make sense. The cost of that legend, though, was never abstract. It turned a real family into targets in the imagination of an entire city, hung a bounty over people who had done nothing but be born adjacent to Eric Holder, and made going to visit him sound like signing your own name onto a hit list. The invisible shield around Nipsey's memory extended over these people too, not as protection, but as threat. And whether or not a single one of them was ever actually harmed, all of them were sentenced in the public mind to a punishment for a crime they didn't commit. That is what a rumor of this size does. It doesn't need to be true to ruin lives. It only needs to be believed. Even the voices trying to cool the city down ended up circling the same fear. The warnings went out that people would tear up the streets seeking revenge on Holder's family, his friends, anyone in his orbit, and that no amount of it would ever bring Nipsey back. A plea that only made sense if everyone already assumed the hunt was real. The rumor had become the water the whole city was swimming in, argued over, condemned, defended, and amplified in the very act of being denied. The more it got debated, the more it hardened into a fact nobody had ever actually verified. And yet the story had a strange internal logic that kept it alive, because if you accepted for even a moment that someone really was cleaning house, then the street already had a name ready for who might be behind it. Not a faceless mob of grieving fans acting on impulse, but a specific man. Someone with the reach to move the neighborhood as a weapon. Someone with a history tangled all the way through Nipsey's rise and a motive that had been sitting in plain sight for a decade. The moment the family rumor took hold, it pointed past the fan base and toward the one figure who had owned a piece of Nipsey Hussle once and never quite let go. Before Nipsey Hussle was anyone's idea of a mogul, there was a man who could make a young rapper's career or bury it, and his name was Big U. He came up as a power broker in the rolling 60s with a reputation earned the hard way, a long stretch in prison behind him after shooting at a cop, and an education in the music business he'd absorbed from Suge Knight himself. The blueprint of a man who'd ruled the West Coast through intimidation and force, dangling artists off balconies and squeezing signatures out of them until the law finally caught up with the operation. Big U studied that model from the inside and built his own version, founding an independent label called Unique Music out of a prison cell in 1996 with his right hand. And when he came home, he went looking for talent with the deep street connections most executives could only dream of. He found Nipsey through a nephew, a talented young Rollin' 60 who was already making noise, and Big U put his machine behind him. He leveraged his contacts into the kind of break unknown artists pray for, landing Nipsey a verse alongside a Tupac posthumous record and a young Dre, a placement that shot the kid's name onto CDs across the city and gave him a foothold nobody hands out for free. He backed the first real single, seeded the mixtape series that built the buzz and locked the relationship into paper, a 10-year production deal signed in 2009 that wouldn't expire until 2019. For a while, it was a partnership. Then it soured, the way these things sour when the money and the trust stop moving in the same direction. The break traced back to a promotional tour and a drug bust when police pulled a vehicle apart and found what they were looking for, and someone stepped up to take the whole charge and ended up with a life sentence. After that, Big U watched his team go cold on him, read the change as a collapse of trust, and drifted out of the day-to-day of Nipsey's career. The theory that hardened in the streets was uglier, that Big U had been running product through Nipsey's tour buses the whole time, using a rising artist's movements as cover, and that Nipsey, watching his own star climb, got nervous about the weight riding alongside his name and started looking for an exit. He put some of it into a record, a diss aimed at the man who'd signed him, telling the world he never needed a middleman and wasn't about to let anybody control him. What came next reads like a neighborhood fable with too many versions to fully trust. Big U confronted him over the track, and by one account tried to make it physical, only to watch Nipsey dance out of reach until the older man tired himself out swinging at air. By another account, it turned into something worse. The gang pulled in, discipline handed out, Nipsey beaten until his brother fired shots into the sky to break it up, and the police rolled in on all of it. There were even whispers that the real fuel was a woman, a child, a family tie that put the two men on opposite sides of something more personal than a contract. However it actually went down, the beef eventually cooled, and the two of them made a public peace. Big U, honoring Nipsey from a stage in 2018, Nipsey returning the respect and calling him a leader, a shout out to the old boss tucked into the album that made him a star. Then came the last chapter before the murder, and it's the one the conspiracy lives inside. In March 2019, Nipsey brought DJ Khaled into the Rollin' 60s hood to shoot a music video without clearing it the way the neighborhood expected, and the shoot went sideways fast. Members reportedly sent to cause trouble, the whole production forced to relocate, threats swirling, Nipsey moving with a heavy security detail because word had reached him that his life might be in danger. His brother later confirmed that someone had pressed them that day without naming who. And a handful of days after that tension, Nipsey lay dead in a parking lot less than a mile from where Big U had grown up. From there, the theory built itself out of a pile of details that each looked bad on its own. The 10-year contract was expiring the same year Nipsey died, and a Nipsey who refused to re-sign gave a motive to a man who'd invested a decade. Big U told different stories about where he'd been that day, in one telling placing himself at the scene with the streets blocked off, and another swearing he wasn't even in town. He skipped the funeral. A clip surfaced of him appearing to laugh when a commenter typed justice for Nipsey into his live stream. And in a 2025 federal racketeering case that painted his operation as an extortion enterprise, investigators claimed to be sitting on tens of thousands of intercepted communications, including a line where he described himself as the only man from his era still having people killed, and another where he called himself a bigger Rollin' 60 than Nipsey ever was. The intercepts made him sound like exactly the man the theory needed. In one, he talked about pulling up on a block to show out, the way he claimed he had on the last person who mistook him for retired. In another, the federal case framed his whole operation as an extortion racket built on that reputation. A man boasting on a wiretap and a man tied to a specific murder, though, sit a long distance apart, and talk that plays like a confession in a documentary can mean an argument, a fistfight, or nothing at all once a courtroom starts asking for proof. Reputation was the currency Big U traded in his whole life. Trading in it is a separate thing from spending it on Nipsey Hussle. The loudest fuel of all came from a man called Loose Cannon, later revealed in that same federal complaint to be an alleged former enforcer who ran robberies for Big U's crew. On a podcast, he told a story that stopped the room, that Big U had told him Nipsey was dead before it happened, video calling him with the news, prompting Loose Cannon to phone Nipsey directly and find him alive and answering, only for the man to be gunned down half an hour later. The implication was that Big U had advanced knowledge, a window into a killing that hadn't occurred yet. The clip was explosive enough that a cease and desist arrived and the host quietly pulled it down. Lay it all in a row and it feels like a case. Pull on any single thread and it comes apart in your hand. The shooter killed over the snitch beef, a motive that stands entirely on its own and needs no puppet master behind it. Investigators combed Holder's phone with everything they had, especially the calls around that day, and turned up no line connecting him to Big U. Holder himself never once said the name, through a whole trial, through a fight for the rest of his life behind bars, when naming a shot caller would have been the golden ticket. A federal cooperation deal, a lighter number, the single most valuable card a convicted man can hold. He never played it, because there was likely nothing to play. The Rollin' 60s don't move as one obedient unit that a single man can aim like a rifle. They're a scatter of crews and cliques who respect Big U without jumping every time he speaks, and the idea that he could push a button and produce a coordinated hit runs against how the set actually functions. Loose Cannon, meanwhile, has been caught inventing so many stories that even the people who platform him treat his word as entertainment. The same man who once placed Big U at the scene of an entirely different rapper's killing. The people who knew Big U personally and covered him for years rejected the whole thing flatly, pointing out that Holder murdered a man for calling him a snitch and that no theory needs a curtain pulled back to explain it. Strip the conspiracy down to the studs, and the simplest reading is the one that keeps surviving. A damaged, volatile man, already armed and already unraveling, got humiliated with the worst word his world knows in front of the neighborhood's favorite son, drove around the block long enough for the shame to harden into rage, and came back to answer it the way the code told him to. No orders, no enterprise, just a fuse and a match. And yet, even after you've knocked down every version of the theory, one thing refuses to fall because it's the only element every telling shares. None of this. Not the murder, not the shield of vengeance, not the beatings, not the family rumor, not the decade of conspiracy that grew up around a dead man's name. None of it happens if the man bleeding out in that parking lot had been anyone other than exactly who he was. To grasp why a single killing detonated an entire city, you have to go back to the boy who left home at 14 and jumped into the rolling 60s, because the distance he traveled from that corner is the whole reason his death felt like a wound to everyone who ever stood on one. Ermias Asghedom grew up in Crenshaw and got pulled into the same gang life that pulled in Holder, hustling young, learning the streets before he learned much else. The turn came in 2004, when a trip to Eritrea with his father and brother rewired something in him, sent him home with an entrepreneur's mind and a mission to lift the neighborhood instead of just surviving it. The stage name came from a childhood friend who watched him grind and thought of the comedian Nipsey Hussle, a nod to a work ethic that never switched off. He built the career the hard way, on his own terms, selling music out of his own hand before any label believed in him, moving physical copies like a man running a business because that's exactly what he was doing. The independent releases earned him local weight and then real deals, and the mixtapes stacked up until he pulled a move that made the whole industry look, pricing a project at $100 a copy and watching Jay-Z buy 100 of them at once, a statement that a rapper from Slauson had figured out something the majors hadn't. Victory Lap arrived in 2018 and earned a Grammy nomination, and after he was gone, the awards kept coming. The recognition catching up to a man who'd spent his life a step ahead of it. The independence was the entire point, the thing he preached like gospel. He built a formula around owning his masters, selling straight to the people who loved the music, and refusing the deals that would have handed his name to somebody else, and he outworked nearly everyone around him doing it. The awards kept arriving after he was gone. Posthumous Grammy wins for the records that outlived him. Honors for a body of work the industry had been slow to celebrate while he was alive to enjoy it. He turned himself into a made man in the truest sense of it, a rapper who answered to no label and no boss, which is exactly why the theories about a boss pulling his strings from the shadows were so seductive and so impossible to prove. The whole shape of his life argued against a puppet master because no one had worked harder to make sure he'd never have one. But the music was almost the smaller half of him. He took the money and poured it back into the exact blocks that made him, buying the Slauson Plaza outright and the businesses inside it, opening Marathon Clothing on ground he owned, building Vector 90 as a co-working and STEM space to wire young people in South LA into opportunities most of them were never supposed to touch. He funded improvements at schools, mentored kids, spoke openly about his own gang past so the ones coming up might choose differently, and lent his name to Destination Crenshaw, a project meant to celebrate the culture that raised him. He planned to build low-income housing right there in his own plaza, and he was one day from sitting across a table from the LAPD to hammer out ways to reduce the violence that had defined his neighborhood for decades. He was killed the afternoon before that meeting. Sit with the shape of that. A man from a set that had buried generations of its own was one day from sitting down with the department that had spent decades at war with his neighborhood to work through how to stop the dying. And he died first, at the hands of someone from his own set, over a rumor, in the lot he'd bought back with his own money. The irony ran all the way through it, and the city felt every inch. That's the reason the city couldn't hold itself together. Nipsey was living proof of the thing everyone from a place like that is told is impossible. That you can make it out, come back, plant your money and your body right in the middle of where you started, and have it be a triumph instead of a death sentence. He bought back the block. He kept it real and stayed alive doing it. And he'd made staying alive look like the whole point. And then he died anyway, in front of his own store, over a rumor, at the hands of one of his own. The exact fate he'd spent his life trying to spare the kids behind him. The contradiction was unbearable, and a city that couldn't bear it went looking for somewhere to put the weight. The grief was enormous because the man was enormous. A former president wrote about what he'd meant. The funeral procession moved through South Central and drew crowds that stretched for miles, a scale of mourning usually reserved for heads of state. And in the most unlikely tribute of all, Gang leaders across Los Angeles called ceasefires and sat down for peace summits in his name. The violence pausing to honor a man who died trying to end it. That is the size of the vacuum his death left, and vacuums like that don't stay empty. They fill with whatever the community has the most of. And in the spring of 2019, that was rage and helplessness in equal measure. He'd been more than a name on a marquee to those blocks. He was a landlord who hired locally, a mentor who actually showed up, a man who stood in front of young dudes from the area as living proof that the corner didn't have to be the ceiling. Losing him read as losing the one person who'd made the impossible look like a plan, and a neighborhood that had watched him model a way out now had to watch that way out get gunned down in daylight. That's the kind of blow that doesn't produce mourning so much as a demand that someone, somewhere pay a price large enough to match it. Everything that fell on Eric Holder poured out of that vacuum. The beatings in jail, the degradation on the bus, the shield of vengeance that hardened around Nipsey's memory, and the legend that Holder's whole family had been erased to balance the scales. All of it was the overflow of a love too big to be answered by anything as small as a courtroom. 60 years to life was never going to feel equal to what was taken, so the streets wrote a bigger sentence in their imagination, one where the punishment reached past the killer and consumed his entire bloodline, because only a punishment that total could stand in for a loss this size. So here's where the honest accounting lands. The family was almost certainly never wiped out. No record supports it. No case ties a single death to revenge for Nipsey. And the one man most often accused of orchestrating the whole thing was never connected to the trigger by anything sturdier than a rumor and a liar's story. What's true is smaller, and it's heavier at the same time. A great man died over nothing. His killer vanished into a cell and a cloud of hatred deep enough to follow him for the rest of his life. And a city that could not bring Nipsey back built a legend where justice went all the way to the root, because the alternative was accepting that nothing would ever be enough. The tale of the wiped out family isn't a crime that happened. It's a monument the neighborhood raised to how much he mattered, a measure of grief disguised as a body count. Hold the two side by side and the real story turns out heavier than the legend ever was. The invented massacre lets the mind rest because it says the scales finally balance. The truth refuses that comfort. It says a builder died over a whisper. His killer will grow old, anonymous, and despised, and the ledger never balanced at all because nothing could ever be entered on the other side that would equal what left that parking lot on a stretcher. Eric Holder is going to grow old in prison, hated, and half forgotten, and the people who share his name are going to keep living whatever lives the rumor tried to take from them. Nipsey stays what he always was, the marathon he never stopped talking about, the one that was always supposed to continue without any single runner. It's still going. It just runs without him now.